The chamber went silent the moment I stepped through the doors, and I felt every eye in the room lock onto me like weapons finding their target. My name is Maya Doyle, and I was 29 years old when I became the first human being to stand inside the Great Hall of the Galactic Council. I had trained for this moment for 3 years. Nothing could have prepared me for it. The hall was built for giants. Pillars of black stone rose so high that their tops vanished into shadow. Around a circular floor sat 40 raised platforms, one for each member species of the council, and on every platform stood a delegate who was studying me the way a butcher studies livestock. I was alone. Earth had sent only me, because the council's invitation had allowed only one representative per newly discovered species, and because nobody back home had believed I would actually need backup for a formality. I know now how wrong we all were. At the center of the hall, on a platform taller than the rest, stood the Vorlex speaker. It was the closest thing the council had to a face, an insectoid figure nearly 9 feet tall, with a smooth dark shell that caught the light in strange colors, and 6 clawed limbs that clicked softly against the stone floor whenever it moved. Its voice, when it finally spoke, came out low and even, translated into perfect English by the small device clipped to my collar. Representative of the species designated Homo sapiens, it said, you stand before the Galactic Council on the occasion of your species' formal cataloging. Do you understand the purpose of this gathering? I straightened my shoulders and tried to keep my voice steady. I was told this was a first contact ceremony, I said, a welcome. A sound rippled through the chamber, and it took me a moment to realize it was laughter. Not cruel laughter, not exactly. It was the kind of laughter you hear from people who have seen the same mistake made 1,000 times before and have grown tired of correcting it. There is no welcome, the Vorlex speaker said. There is only the ledger. At those words, 2 smaller drones floated out from behind the platform, carrying between them a thin sheet of glowing crystal, covered in symbols I could not read. My translator worked through them slowly, and as it did, my stomach began to sink. Every species catalogued by this council, the speaker continued, is required to offer tribute, as proof of its willingness to exist peacefully within galactic order. This is not a request. It is the price of your survival as a recognized civilization. Tribute, I repeated. What kind of tribute? The speaker's claws clicked together, a gesture I would later learn was the Vorlex equivalent of patience wearing thin. Resources, territory, technology, or population, offered as laborers to serve the council's various projects. Your species may choose the form. You may not choose to refuse. I stood there in that vast stone hall, thousands of light years from home, and felt something cold settle into my chest. I had read every briefing document Earth's diplomats could gather in the weeks since the council's ships first appeared at the edge of our solar system. None of them had prepared me for the word laborers. I looked around the chamber, searching the platforms for any sign of sympathy. What I found instead was worse than hostility. I found pity. On a platform to my left stood a delegate from a species called the Thren, tall and pale, with long fingers that never stopped moving. When our eyes met, the Thren delegate looked away quickly, almost ashamed. Further around the circle, a squat, 4-legged being covered in dense fur shifted its weight and would not look at me at all. They had all been here before. Every single species in this chamber had once stood exactly where I stood now, hearing the same demand for the first time. How much time, I asked, forcing the words out evenly, does my species have to decide? 1 solar cycle of your homeworld, the speaker said. You will return to your people. You will explain the terms. You will send your answer through the relay beacon left in your system. If no answer arrives, or if the answer is refusal, a correctional fleet will be dispatched to ensure compliance. Correctional fleet. I filed the phrase away, my hands trembling slightly at my sides even as I tried to keep my face calm. And if we refuse, I said, what happens to the people who refused before us? For the first time, something in the speaker's posture shifted. It was subtle, but I caught it. A slight tilt of the head, almost curious. There is a full record, it said. Would you like to see it? I said yes, before I had time to think better of it. The crystal sheet in front of the drones flickered, and images began to form in the air above it, silent and cold. I watched cities burning on worlds I would never visit. I watched fleets of ships, unimaginably larger than anything humanity had ever built, moving in formation over planets that had once, presumably, been full of life, and now were not. The images did not linger long enough to show detail. They did not need to. The message was clear enough without it, and I felt sick as I watched, my jaw tight, forcing myself not to look away because I knew I needed to remember every second of it for the people waiting back home. Every species shown here chose refusal, the speaker said quietly. We do not enjoy correction. It is costly, even for us. But the order of this galaxy depends on consistency. If tribute could be refused without consequence, tribute would cease to mean anything. I thought of Earth. I thought of the blue and green planet spinning quietly in its ordinary corner of an ordinary galaxy, full of people who had no idea that a decision this large was about to fall on their shoulders, because of one nervous woman standing in a stone room full of strangers. I need to speak with my government, I said, before I can give any kind of answer. That is expected, the speaker replied. That is why you have one solar cycle. Use it wisely, Representative Doyle. Very few species use their time well. The chamber began to empty around me, delegates drifting away from their platforms in twos and threes, murmuring in languages my translator did not even attempt to render. I stood alone at the center of that enormous hall for a long moment, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. Before I turned to leave, one figure remained behind on a lower platform near the exit. It was an old being, its skin a deep shade of green, its eyes a strange pale gold. It did not speak to me. It simply watched me go, its expression unreadable, and something about the way it studied me made the back of my neck prickle. I did not understand that look until much later. At the time, I only wanted to get back to the shuttle, back to the stars, back to Earth, before I lost whatever composure I had left. The journey home took 6 days, by the fastest route our new allies, the same beings who had first made contact and quietly warned us what the summons truly meant, were willing to share with us. 6 days of staring out at the black expanse of space, replaying the speaker's words over and over in my mind. Resources, territory, technology, population, offered as laborers. 3 years earlier, humanity had been a species that still argued about which nations owned which oceans. Now we were expected to hand over a portion of ourselves to strangers who had already decided, long before I ever set foot in that hall, exactly what our answer should be. I did not know yet what my people would choose. I did not know that in 6 days, when I finally stepped off that shuttle and onto the tarmac of a quiet airbase outside a city I loved, I would be carrying the weight of a decision that would define whether humanity took its place among the stars as a subject, or as something the galaxy had never quite seen before. I only knew one thing for certain as our shuttle broke away from that ancient, terrible hall and turned its nose toward home. Whatever answer we gave, there would be no taking it back. The deadline was set, the ledger was recorded, and somewhere far behind me, in a chamber built for giants, 40 species were already placing quiet bets on how quickly the newest name in their records would learn to kneel. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Neither, if I am honest, did I. The airbase was cold when I landed, the kind of gray, damp cold that settles into your bones after too many hours in artificial air. A small convoy of black vehicles waited on the tarmac, engines running, doors already open. I recognized the woman standing beside the lead car, before I even reached the bottom of the ramp. Her name was Grace Linwood, the newly appointed head of Earth's Unified Diplomatic Corps, the woman who had sent me to that chamber in the first place. She did not smile when she saw me. She simply studied my face, the way a doctor studies test results they already suspect are bad news. "How bad?" she asked, without any greeting at all. I opened my mouth to answer, and found that my voice had gone completely dry. "Get me to a secure room," I said instead, "and get every world leader who can be reached in the next 6 hours on a call. This isn't something I can explain twice." Grace Linwood did not argue. She simply nodded once, turned on her heel, and led me toward the waiting car, and somewhere behind us, unseen and unheard, the countdown toward humanity's answer had already begun. The secure room beneath the diplomatic compound had no windows, only banks of monitors lining every wall, each one holding the tense, waiting face of a different world leader. Grace Linwood sat beside me at the long table, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the largest screen at the front of the room, where the president of the newly formed Earth Council waited in silence for my report. I had rehearsed what I would say during the entire 6-day journey home. Somewhere over the black distance between stars, every careful sentence I had prepared simply fell apart, and by the time I stood to speak, I found myself telling the truth in the plainest words I had. They want tribute, I said. Resources, territory, technology, or people, handed over as laborers. If we refuse, they send what they call a correctional fleet. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then the questions began, overlapping, sharp, frightened. "What kind of fleet?" asked a general from the North American delegation, a broad-shouldered man named Peter Hale, who had spent most of his career preparing for wars that never came. "I don't know exactly," I admitted, "but they showed me records. Other worlds that refused, cities destroyed. Fleets larger than anything we have ever built, moving like they were nothing at all." "Could this be a bluff?" someone else asked. "A test to see how we respond under pressure?" "I don't think so," I said. "I think it's simply how they operate. It isn't personal to them, it's policy." Grace Linwood leaned forward, her voice low and even. "Then we need options, real ones, not panic." For the next several hours, the room filled with argument after argument, voices rising and falling, as delegates from every corner of the world tried to grasp the size of the decision now sitting in front of them. Some wanted immediate compliance, a small token offering of resources to buy time. Others wanted total secrecy, hiding Earth's location, and hoping the Council would simply lose interest. A few, quietly, wondered aloud whether it might be easier to simply hand over territory that nobody would miss. I sat through most of it without speaking, watching the fear pass from face to face like a current running through water. It was General Hale who finally stood, silencing the room with nothing more than the scrape of his chair against the floor. "I've spent 30 years studying how empires rise and fall," he said. "I've read every account we have of conquest, resistance, and surrender, going back thousands of years. And there's one thing history teaches over and over again, whether it's an empire on this planet, or apparently one out among the stars. The moment you hand over a single laborer, a single acre of land, a single piece of technology as tribute, you haven't bought peace. You've bought yourself a permanent place at the bottom." "So what would you have us do?" Grace Linwood asked. "Fight a fleet we can't even see yet?" "I would have us decide who we are," Hale said, "before someone else decides it for us." His words settled over the room, and for the first time since I had returned from that stone chamber among the stars, I saw something other than fear cross the faces around me. I saw the beginning of resolve. Over the following days, the debate continued in smaller rooms, in private calls, in quiet conversations between leaders who had spent most of their careers as rivals and now found themselves needing each other more than ever. I was pulled into meeting after meeting, asked to describe every detail of the chamber, the speaker, the images of ruined cities, over and over until the memory felt worn smooth from repetition. It was during one of these meetings, late on the third night, that an elderly historian named Edith Marsh asked to speak with me privately. She had been brought in as a consultant, someone the Earth Council trusted to place humanity's decision in the context of everything that had come before it. We sat together in a small side office, a single lamp casting long shadows across stacks of old books she had insisted on bringing with her, despite every modern archive available at her fingertips. "Tell me something," she said, "when they showed you those images. The cities, the ruined worlds. What did the other delegates do while you watched?" I thought back, remembering the chamber, the platforms, the way the Thren delegate had looked away in shame. "They looked uncomfortable," I said. "Some of them wouldn't meet my eyes." Edith Marsh nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed something she already suspected. "That tells me something important," she said. "A government that is truly confident in its power doesn't need its subjects to feel ashamed. Shame only exists where there's still a memory of choice." Somewhere in that chamber, among all those species who bowed, there are people who remember what it was like before they knelt. "What does that mean for us?" I asked. "It means the Council's order isn't as solid as they want you to believe," she said. "Empires that have never faced resistance don't bother keeping records of the ones who refused. They erase them. The fact that this Council keeps such a careful ledger of defiance tells me they're not just recording history, they're managing fear. Yours and everyone else's." Her words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. turning over and over in my mind, as the days ticked closer to the deadline. On the 5th day, the full Earth Council convened for a final vote, broadcast quietly to every government on the planet, though the public at large still knew only fragments of what was truly at stake. I stood near the back of the chamber, watching as representatives from every continent took their turn at the podium. Some spoke of caution, of buying time, of finding some middle path that might satisfy the council without truly submitting to it. Others spoke of principle, of the simple, stubborn refusal to hand over a single human life as payment for the right to exist. It was Grace Linwood who spoke last, her voice steady, despite the exhaustion clearly written across her face after days without proper rest. "We are not the first species to stand at this crossroads," she said, "but every account Maya Doyle has brought us, every historical pattern our researchers have found, tells us the same thing. Compliance does not end with peace. It ends with dependence, and eventually, with disappearance. If we are going to exist among the stars, we will do so as ourselves, not as someone else's laborers." The vote, when it finally came, was not unanimous. Nothing involving that many nations, that many fears, ever truly is. But it was overwhelming, and when the final count was read aloud, a strange, heavy silence fell over the chamber. The silence of a decision too large to fully comprehend even after it has been made. Humanity would refuse the tribute. What came next was not celebration. There was no cheering, no relief. Instead, the following days became a blur of frantic preparation, as governments that had spent decades distrusting one another suddenly found themselves working side by side, pooling resources, sharing research, building towards something none of them fully understood yet. I was asked, along with a small team of scientists and military planners, to help translate everything I had learned about the Council's technology, their fleet patterns, their methods of correction, into something Earth's defense planners could actually use. It was during these long nights of work that I began to understand just how strange humanity's advantage truly was. We did not have their weapons, we did not have their ships, or their instant communication across vast distances, or their casual mastery of energy on a scale that still made my head spin whenever I thought too long about it. What we had instead was something the Council, in all its careful records of conquest, seemed to have consistently underestimated. We had thousands of years of practice surviving each other. Every trick of deception, every method of hiding in plain sight, every strategy for making a smaller force punch far above its weight, had already been tested, refined, and written down somewhere in humanity's long, difficult history. We simply had to remember it and apply it to a threat that had never before had to fight an enemy quite like us. A young engineer named Daniel Cole, barely out of his 20s, presented one of the first proposals that truly caught my attention. Rather than trying to match the Council's fleet ship for ship, an impossible task in the time we had, he suggested turning Earth's own orbital debris, decades of old satellites and spent rocket stages, into a defensive minefield disguised as ordinary junk. "They'll be expecting weapons," he explained to a room full of skeptical generals. "They won't be expecting garbage." It was a small idea, almost laughable at first glance, but it captured something larger that was slowly taking shape across every branch of Earth's preparation. We could not outmuscle the Council. We could, perhaps, outthink them. As the solar cycle drew to its final week, I was called once more into a private meeting with Grace Linwood and General Hale. The three of us gathered around a table covered in maps of the solar system and projected fleet formations. "It's almost time to send our answer," Grace said. "The Council is expecting a formal response through the relay beacon, something with weight, something official." "They'll expect excuses," Hale said. "Conditions. A partial offering dressed up as full compliance. That's the pattern, isn't it?" That's what every other species tried first. I thought of the chamber again, the ledger, the images of burning cities, the ashamed silence of delegates who had once, presumably, stood exactly where humanity now stood. "Then we shouldn't give them a pattern to expect," I said slowly. "We should give them something they've never had to record before." Grace Linwood looked at me for a long moment, something sharpening in her expression. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. I told her. It was General Hale who laughed first, a short, surprised sound that broke the tension hanging over the room, and Grace Linwood's mouth curved into the first real smile I had seen on her face since the day I stepped off that shuttle, 3 words, she said quietly, almost to herself. It's short enough to be an insult, and exactly long enough to be a promise. The following morning, the Earth Council voted, formally and unanimously this time, to send that reply, and I was given the task of transmitting it myself, since it was I who would have to stand once more inside that ancient stone hall to deliver it face to face. As the shuttle carrying me back toward the relay beacon lifted off from the same tarmac where I had landed only days before, I found myself thinking of the elderly historian's words, about empires that had never truly faced resistance, and about the strange, careful shame I had seen flicker across the faces of delegates who remembered, somewhere deep down, what it meant to choose. I did not know exactly what would happen when I delivered our answer. I did not know whether the correctional fleet, once summoned, could truly be stopped by garbage disguised as minefields and centuries of hard-won cunning. I only knew that for the first time since stepping into that terrible chamber, I was not afraid of what I carried with me. I was proud of it. The chamber felt different the second time I entered it, though nothing about the stone pillars or the silent, waiting platforms had actually changed. What had changed was me. I walked to the center of that vast hall without the trembling uncertainty of my first visit, my spine straight, my translator clipped firmly to my collar, and the full weight of humanity's decision resting steady in my chest instead of pressing down on it. The Vorlek speaker stood waiting on its platform exactly as before, its claws clicking softly in what I now understood was simple, patient habit rather than any particular emotion. Around the circle, delegates from 40 species turned their attention toward me, some curious, some already bored, clearly expecting the same tired negotiation they had witnessed countless times. Representative Doyle, the speaker said, you have returned within the appointed time. Your people have reached a decision regarding tribute. We have, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. Then present the terms of your compliance, the speaker said, so that they may be entered into the ledger. I let the silence stretch for just a moment, long enough to feel every eye in that chamber settle fully on me, long enough for the weight of the pause to matter. There are no terms, I said, there is no compliance. A murmur rippled across the platforms, quiet and uncertain, the same restless energy I remembered from my first visit, though this time, edged with something sharper. The speaker's claws stopped clicking entirely. Then you refuse the tribute, it said slowly, as though giving me one final chance to reconsider, before the word became permanent. We refuse, I said. And we have a message for the council, exactly as it was given to me, word for word. The speaker tilted its head, an almost imperceptible gesture I had learned to recognize as genuine curiosity. Deliver it, it said. I looked around that ancient chamber one final time, at the pale, restless Thren delegate, at the old green-skinned figure near the exit whose gold eyes had never quite left me, at every representative of every species who had once, presumably, stood exactly where I now stood, and I spoke the 3 words that would carry humanity's answer across the stars and into the history books of an entire galaxy. Come and take it. For a long moment, nothing happened at all. The chamber held its silence, the way a held breath holds still before it breaks, and I stood at the center of that vast stone hall, waiting to see which way the moment would fall. My translator had rendered the words correctly, I knew that much. What I could not know, standing there with my heart hammering against my ribs, was whether anyone in that room would understand what those 3 words actually meant. The Vorlek speaker was the first to move, tilting its head at an angle that seemed almost mechanical, as though it were running the phrase through some internal process, searching for context that simply was not there. Come and take it, it repeated slowly, testing the shape of the words. This is your formal response. A challenge, rather than a refusal. It is our answer, I said, exactly as it was given to me. Around the circle of platforms, reactions began to ripple outward, and I found myself watching them with a strange, detached fascination, the way you might watch weather move across an open field. The Thren delegate, the pale, long-fingered being who had looked away from me in shame during my first visit, now leaned forward instead, its restless hands going suddenly still. A squat, 4-legged delegate, near the far side of the chamber, made a sound I did not need a translator to understand. It was laughter, sharp and disbelieving, quickly stifled behind a raised paw when other delegates turned to look. "They cannot possibly mean this literally," said a voice from one of the higher platforms, belonging to a tall, crystalline being whose entire body seemed to shift color as it spoke. "No species facing correction has ever responded with open invitation. Perhaps they do not understand the scale of what awaits them," another delegate offered. I felt a flicker of anger at that, quickly buried beneath the calm I had promised myself I would maintain, no matter what was said in that room. "We understand perfectly well," I said, loud enough to carry across the murmuring chamber. "We have seen your ledger. We have seen the cities. We understand exactly what a correctional fleet is capable of." "And still you refuse," the Vorlek speaker said. "And still we refuse." The murmuring grew louder, a dozen conversations overlapping in languages my translator strained to keep pace with, until a single voice cut through the noise, low and even, carrying a weight that silenced the chamber more effectively than any authority the speaker itself seemed to hold. "I would like to hear more," the voice said, "about where those words come from." I turned to find the source, and was not entirely surprised to see the old, green-skinned delegate from the lower platform near the exit, the one whose pale gold eyes had followed me so closely during my first visit. It rose slowly from its seated position, moving with the careful deliberation of something very old, and very tired, and very far from finished. "Representative Doyle," it said, "my designation is Elder Vesh, of the Korai. My species was catalogued by this council 11,000 of your years ago. We were, at the time, considered among the most fiercely independent peoples this galaxy had encountered. Tell me, does that phrase carry meaning for your people beyond this chamber? A history, perhaps?" I hesitated, surprised by the question, and then found myself answering honestly, because some instinct told me honesty was exactly what this ancient being was looking for. "It does," I said. "It comes from moments in our history when small groups of people, facing much larger, much stronger forces, refused to hand over their weapons or their freedom, even when surrender seemed like the only reasonable choice. Sometimes those small groups lost. Sometimes, against every expectation, they did not. Either way, the words became something larger than the moment they were spoken in, a promise, passed down, about what a people intend to become, regardless of the cost." Elder Vesh was quiet for a long moment, its gold eyes distant, as though looking through me, toward some memory far older than I could imagine. "We had a phrase like that once," it said finally. "Before the correction, before the ledger. I do not remember the words themselves. I remember only that we stopped saying them, generation after generation, until eventually there was nothing left to say at all." A heavy silence settled over the chamber at that, different from the restless murmuring of before, something closer to grief than curiosity. The Vorlek speaker's claws clicked once, sharply, cutting through the moment. "Sentiment does not alter policy," it said. "A refusal remains a refusal, regardless of its poetry. The Council will convene to authorize appropriate correction." "Wait," Elder Vesh said, and something in its tone made even the speaker pause. "I ask only that the Council consider the pattern being repeated here, rather than dismissing it as simple defiance. Every species that has ever resisted correction believed itself capable of victory. Most were wrong. But I have studied the histories available to us, Speaker, longer than most beings in this chamber have been alive, and I have never once seen a species arrive at its first contact with active planetary defenses already in place, weapon systems already deployed, decades before any threat was known to exist." The speaker's head tilted again, that same mechanical curiosity from before. "Explain your meaning, Elder." "I mean," Vesh said, turning to look directly at me, "that these people did not build their defenses because of us. They built them long before we arrived, out of habit, out of fear of one another. A species that has spent its entire history preparing for conflict with itself may prove considerably more difficult to correct than one that has spent its history in peace." I had not expected to feel a strange, complicated pride at those words, an old historian's warning dressed up as a compliment, but I did, standing there in that ancient hall, while an alien elder who had watched his own people's spirit slowly ground down over 11,000 years, tried, in his own careful way, to warn the Council against making the same mistake with mine. The speaker considered this for a long moment, its claws finally falling still. The Council will take the observation under advisement, it said. It does not change the outcome. A correctional fleet will be dispatched to the human system within your homeworld's next lunar cycle. The scale of the response will be proportional to the nature of the refusal. Given the deliberate and public nature of this defiance, the Council authorizes a full punitive contingent, rather than the standard minimal correction. I felt the floor seem to shift slightly beneath me at those words, though I kept my expression carefully still. A full punitive contingent, not the small, targeted force I had allowed myself to hope for, based on the quieter warnings my briefings had prepared me for, but something larger, something meant to make an example severe enough that no other newly catalogued species would ever consider following humanity's lead. Is there anything further you wish to say, Representative Doyle? The Speaker asked, before this session concludes. I thought of Grace Linwood, of General Hale, of Edith Marsh and her stacks of old books, of Daniel Cole and his strange, brilliant idea about turning garbage into a minefield. I thought of every person back home who had voted, argued, and finally agreed that whatever came next, it would come to a species that had chosen its own fate, rather than accepting one handed down from a stone hall built for giants. Only this, I said. You keep a careful record of every species that has ever refused you. I imagine that record exists, because somewhere, in the long history of this council, you learned that refusal is worth remembering. I would ask you to remember this moment carefully, Speaker. Whatever happens next. The Speaker did not respond to that, though I thought, just for a moment, that something flickered behind its dark, unreadable eyes. The session ended shortly after, delegates drifting away from their platforms in the same quiet, murmuring clusters as before, though the tone had shifted entirely from my first visit. Where once I had felt only pity directed toward me, I now felt something closer to unsettled curiosity, dozens of ancient eyes trying to work out whether they had just witnessed the beginning of a tragedy, or something else entirely. Elder Vesh remained behind once more, exactly as before, and this time, as I turned to leave, he spoke one final time, his voice pitched low enough that I doubted the translator carried it beyond the two of us. Whatever you have built to defend your homeworld, Representative Doyle, he said, I hope it is enough. Not for the Council's sake, for yours. My people were not given the chance to test their own defiance before it was taken from us entirely. Do not waste the chance you have been given. I did not have an answer for him. I only nodded once, and made my way back toward the waiting shuttle, carrying with me not just the Council's authorization of a full punitive fleet, but the quiet, aching warning of an old, broken people who remembered, even after 11,000 years, exactly what it felt like to lose the words that once defined them. The journey home felt longer this time, though the route was the same. I spent most of it reviewing everything I had learned, cross-referencing it against the reports Daniel Cole and his team had been compiling in my absence, trying to understand exactly what a full punitive contingent might mean in practical terms, and whether anything humanity had built in the short time since my first visit could possibly stand against it. By the time my shuttle broke back into Earth's orbit, the planet below looked exactly as it always had, blue and green and quietly indifferent to the enormous decision now hurtling toward it from somewhere out among the stars. I found myself staring down at it for a long moment before the shuttle began its descent, thinking of Elder Vesh's words, of a species that had once had defiance of its own, and had somehow let it slip away, one quiet generation at a time. Whatever came next, I promised myself, watching my homeworld grow larger in the viewport, humanity would not let that happen to us. Not without a fight. Grace Linwood was waiting on the tarmac again when I landed, though this time General Hale stood beside her, along with a small group of military planners I did not recognize, all of them wearing the particular kind of tense, focused expression that told me the preparations back home had moved considerably further along in my absence. Well, Grace said, as I stepped down from the shuttle, how did they take it? About as well as you'd expect, I said. They're sending a full punitive contingent, within the lunar cycle. Whatever color remained in Grace Linwood's face drained away at that, though General Hale, to my surprise, simply nodded slowly, as though the news confirmed something he had already suspected. Good, he said quietly. Better to know exactly what we're facing than to keep guessing. Good, I repeated, staring at him. General, Do you understand what a full punitive contingent means? I understand it means they're taking us seriously, Hale said, which means our answer landed exactly the way it was meant to. Now it's our turn to make sure they remember exactly why that was a mistake. He turned and began walking briskly toward the waiting convoy of vehicles, already speaking into a small communicator clipped to his uniform, calling in commanders from bases scattered across every continent. Grace Linwood lingered beside me a moment longer, her eyes searching my face. "There's something else," I said quietly, before she could turn to follow him. "One of the delegates, an old being called Elder Vesh. His people refused the council once too, 11,000 years ago. And it didn't end well for them," I said. "He told me they lost something after that. Not just a war, something in how they saw themselves. He was trying to warn me." Grace Linwood was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the sunlight fade behind the distant hills beyond the airbase. "Then we'll make sure that warning wasn't wasted," she said finally, and together, we followed General Hale toward whatever came next. The lunar cycle the council had given us passed faster than anyone back home was truly ready for. I spent those final weeks moving between command centers on 3 different continents, translating everything I could remember about council fleet formations, correction tactics, and communication patterns into briefings that Daniel Cole and a rapidly growing team of engineers used to refine humanity's defenses. Sleep became something I measured in stolen hours rather than full nights. I do not think I was alone in that. The plan that finally took shape was not what I had expected when I first agreed to deliver humanity's 3-word answer. It was not a fleet of gleaming warships, built in secret and unveiled at the last possible moment, the kind of thing I half suspected some of the more optimistic engineers had been quietly hoping for. It was something stranger, and in its own way, far more unsettling to think about. Earth's true defense was built on subtraction rather than addition, on making ourselves harder to strike rather than easier to see. Decades of old satellites, spent rocket stages, and decommissioned space stations, junk that had been drifting quietly in orbit for years, were quietly repositioned into dense, tangled fields around every major population center, disguised through careful signal manipulation to appear as nothing more than the same harmless debris that had always been there. Buried within that debris, however, sat thousands of small, inexpensive charges, cheap enough to produce in massive quantities, designed not to destroy council ships outright, but to damage, disable, and confuse them, just enough to blunt the edge of an overwhelming force. On the ground, similar principles took hold. Rather than concentrating Earth's limited advanced technology into a handful of obvious targets, easily identified and destroyed from orbit, command structures were deliberately scattered and duplicated across hundreds of hardened, hidden locations, many of them disguised as ordinary buildings in ordinary cities. If the council expected to cut off a single head and watch the body fall still, they were going to be disappointed. "They've never fought anyone like us," General Hale said, during one of our final briefings before the fleet's expected arrival. "Every species in that ledger learned to survive strangers coming from beyond their own sky. We learned to survive each other, for thousands of years, long before we ever looked up and wondered what might be waiting out there. That's not a coincidence. That's a foundation." I wanted desperately to believe him. Standing in the command center on the night the council's fleet finally began its approach, watching the first faint signals appear on our tracking screens, I found myself hoping, more than believing, that a species built on quarrels and mistrust might actually have prepared us, without ever meaning to, for exactly this moment. The fleet arrived in the early hours of a quiet morning, breaking into the solar system in a formation so large that our sensors struggled at first to properly register its full size. Ship after ship emerged from the darkness beyond Neptune, sleek and impossibly advanced, moving with the calm, practiced confidence of a force that had performed this exact maneuver countless times before, on countless other worlds, and had never once needed to worry about the outcome. I watched the readings scroll across the monitors in front of me, my hands clenched tightly in my lap, and thought of every burning city I had seen flash silently across that glowing crystal sheet in the council's chamber. For a brief, terrible moment, I wondered if we had simply been fools, 3 words of stubborn pride standing between an entire planet and the same fate. Then the fleet reached the edge of our disguised debris fields, and everything changed. The first council ships to make contact with the outer minefield clearly expected nothing more than ordinary orbital clutter, the kind every developed system accumulated over time. Their scans, calibrated for the sensor signatures of technology far more advanced than our own, simply failed to register the small charges hidden among the debris as any kind of threat at all. By the time their systems recognized the danger, dozens of ships had already sustained damage, their outer hulls scarred, their sensor arrays and weapon systems disrupted just enough to throw off the precise, coordinated advance the fleet had clearly planned. Confusion rippled through their formation almost immediately, and it was in that confusion that the rest of humanity's plan came into its own. Ground-based systems, scattered and hidden exactly as intended, began firing in staggered, unpredictable patterns, never revealing enough of themselves at once to offer a clean, decisive target. Communication jamming, developed from decades of humanity's own experience disrupting each other's networks during more ordinary conflicts, tangled the fleet's coordination even further, forcing individual ships to make decisions without the constant guidance they had clearly always relied on. I sat in that command center for hours, watching the battle unfold across a dozen different screens, and found myself struck again and again by how different it looked from anything I might have imagined before. There was no single dramatic clash of fleets meeting head-on in open space. There was only a slow, grinding chaos, ship after council vessel, forced to break formation, to improvise, to fight an enemy that refused to present itself in any way their training had prepared them for. "They're not built for this," Daniel Cole said at one point, leaning over a monitor tracking the fleet's increasingly scattered movements. "Look at their formation. They're falling back on old patterns, trying to regroup the way they always have. They don't know how to fight something that won't stay still." Not every part of the defense held perfectly. 2 smaller cities near major coastlines sustained damage from a handful of council ships that managed to break through the outer debris fields before ground defenses could fully engage, and the reports that reached the command center of the resulting evacuations were some of the hardest moments of that long, exhausting battle. I will not pretend the cost was small, or that every plan unfolded exactly as intended. War, even one fought largely through deception and disruption, rather than direct confrontation, still leaves its marks. But as the hours wore on, it became increasingly clear that the Council's fleet, for all its overwhelming size and advanced technology, had arrived expecting a swift, clean correction, and was instead finding itself trapped in exactly the kind of prolonged, unpredictable conflict it had almost certainly never trained for. Ship by ship, the formation that had entered our system with such calm confidence began to fracture, individual commanders forced to choose between continuing an increasingly costly advance or preserving what remained of their fleet. It was General Hale who first noticed the shift in their communications, a change in tone that even our imperfect translation systems could pick up on. "They're requesting new orders," he said, watching a cluster of intercepted signals scroll across his screen. "Multiple ships. They're asking whether to continue the advance or withdraw." Grace Linwood, who had barely left the command center in nearly 2 full days, leaned forward beside him, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "What's the response?" she asked. We did not have to wait long to find out. Within the hour, the remaining council ships, battered, scattered, and clearly no longer operating with anything resembling their original confidence, began pulling back from Earth's orbit, regrouping at a cautious distance, before finally turning away entirely, retreating back toward the edge of the solar system and the long journey home. The command center erupted into something between disbelief and cautious celebration, though I noticed many of the people around me, myself included, holding back from any real sense of victory. We had not destroyed a fleet. We had not proven ourselves equal to the Council's technology, or even come close. We had simply made the cost of correction higher than the Council had expected to pay, at least for now, and I understood, even in that first exhausted moment of relief, that such a thing was very different from safety. "They'll be back," General Hale said quietly, watching the last of the retreating ships vanish from our tracking screens. "Maybe not soon, but they will be back, with a fleet built specifically to answer everything we just showed them. Then we'll be ready for that too," Grace Linwood said, though I could hear the same uncertainty in her voice that I felt sitting heavy in my own chest. I thought of Elder Vesh then, standing alone on his lower platform in that ancient stone hall, watching me with pale gold eyes that remembered, even after 11,000 years, exactly what it felt like to have a fleet like that arrive above your homeworld. I wondered if he was watching now, somewhere far across the galaxy, waiting to see whether the strange, stubborn little species that had spoken 3 defiant words to the council would prove to be another entry in that long, careful ledger of failed resistance, or something the council had genuinely never encountered before. I did not have an answer for that question yet. None of us did. What I did know, standing in that quiet, exhausted command center as the sun rose over a planet that had somehow, against every expectation, survived its first true test among the stars, was that humanity had not simply refused the council's tribute. We had made them retreat. And somewhere out among those same stars, word of that retreat was already beginning to spread. 3 weeks after the retreat of the punitive fleet, I received word that the full Galactic Council, not merely a single speaker acting in its name, wished to convene a session specifically to address what its own internal records were now calling the human anomaly. Grace Linwood insisted on traveling with me this time, along with a small delegation that included General Hale and, to my quiet relief, Edith Marsh, whose careful understanding of history had proven itself far more valuable than any of us had first realized. Earth was no longer sending a single nervous translator into that vast stone hall. This time, we arrived as something closer to equals, even if the council itself had not yet decided whether to acknowledge that shift. The chamber was fuller than I had ever seen it, every platform occupied, delegates murmuring among themselves in a low, restless hum that quieted only slightly as our small group made its way to the center of the floor. I searched the platforms briefly for Elder Vesh, and found him exactly where I remembered, watching our approach with those same pale gold eyes, though something in his posture seemed different now, less resigned, more attentive. The Vorlek speaker addressed us first, its tone carrying none of the calm certainty I remembered from my first 2 visits. Representatives of Earth, it said, the Council has convened to determine the appropriate response to your continued refusal of tribute, and to the losses sustained during the recent correctional action. Several positions have been proposed. You will be permitted to speak once the Council has debated its options. What followed was unlike anything I had witnessed in that chamber before. Rather than the quiet, orderly proceedings I remembered, the debate that unfolded among the assembled delegates was loud, sprawling, and clearly unresolved even among themselves. A genuine disagreement playing out in front of an audience it had probably never expected to have. A delegate from a heavily armored species called the Kethrai argued forcefully for a second, far larger correctional fleet, one built specifically to overwhelm the kind of unconventional resistance humanity had demonstrated. Allow this defiance to stand unanswered, the Kethrai delegate warned, and every species in this ledger will begin asking why they ever accepted correction at all. Others argued for a different approach entirely. The crystalline delegate, whose body shifted color as it spoke, suggested simple isolation, cutting Earth off from all contact with the wider galaxy, and allowing the species to remain undisturbed, unrecognized, and ultimately irrelevant to the Council's affairs. It was Elder Vesh who rose to speak last, his voice carrying an authority the other delegates seemed reluctant to interrupt, whether out of respect for his age or simple curiosity about what an ancient survivor of the Council's own correction might have to say. I have listened carefully to every proposal offered here today, he said, and I find myself troubled by all of them equally. A second fleet risks repeating the same costly failure, only at greater scale, against a species that has already shown itself capable of adapting, faster than our own strategies can account for. Isolation, meanwhile, assumes a species content to remain quiet and unnoticed, when everything we have witnessed suggests exactly the opposite. These people did not build their defenses to be left alone. They built them to be ready for exactly this moment. Then what would you propose, Elder? The Vorlek speaker asked, something almost weary entering its translated voice. Elder Vesh turned, and for the first time since I had met him, addressed me directly in front of the full assembled council. I would propose we ask them, he said, Representative Doyle. Your people refused tribute. You did not, as far as I am aware, refuse contact entirely. What is it, precisely, that Earth wants from this council? Every eye in that vast chamber turned toward me, and I felt Grace Linwood's hand brush briefly against my arm, a small, steadying gesture, before I stepped forward to answer. We do not want tribute, in either direction, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. We are not asking this council to hand over its resources, its technology, or its people to us. and we will not hand over ours to you. What we are offering is something this ledger of yours does not appear to have a category for. Trade, conducted as equals. Knowledge, shared where both sides agree it benefits them. Alliance, where our interests align, and honest distance where they do not. Equals, the Kethri delegate repeated, something sharp and disbelieving in its tone. You are a single, newly catalogued species, barely capable of surviving your own history, and you propose equality with a council that has governed the affairs of this galaxy for longer than your species has existed. With respect, I said, your ledger already proves my point better than I could. Every species listed in it accepted a place beneath this council, and in exchange, this council has apparently never once had to seriously consider the possibility of refusal, until now. We are not claiming to be your equals in power. I do not think anyone in this chamber would believe such a claim, and I would not ask you to. We are simply refusing to accept a place beneath you, because we do not believe survival should require it. The chamber fell into a long, uneasy silence at that, broken finally by Edith Marsh, who stepped forward beside me, her voice carrying the calm, patient authority of someone who had spent a lifetime studying exactly this kind of moment across the long span of human history. If I may, she said, and the speaker inclined its head slightly, permitting her to continue. Every empire my own species has ever built or studied eventually reached a point where the cost of holding power exceeded the benefit of exercising it. It is not weakness that leads a great power to negotiate as equals with a smaller one. It is wisdom, recognizing early that some costs are not worth paying twice. You are suggesting this council should simply set aside 11,000 years of established order, the crystalline delegate said, because a single new species proved inconvenient to correct. I am suggesting, Edith Marsh replied evenly, that a council wise enough to have governed this galaxy for 11,000 years is surely wise enough to recognize when a new approach might serve it better than an old one that has just proven costly to enforce. The debate that followed stretched on for what felt like hours, delegates arguing back and forth across positions that seemed to shift and reform with every new voice that joined the discussion. I stood through most of it beside Grace Linwood and General Hale, answering questions when they were directed at me, but largely watching, fascinated despite the tension, as an ancient institution I had once believed to be perfectly unified, revealed itself to be exactly as complicated and divided as any human government I had ever studied. Near the end of the session, Elder Vesh spoke once more, his final words carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the entire chamber. I do not know whether this council will ultimately choose to negotiate with Earth, or to try correction again at greater cost, he said. But I would ask every delegate here to remember one thing before any decision is finalized. My own people once possessed exactly the kind of defiance these humans have shown here today. We lost it, generation by generation, until there was nothing left to lose. I have spent 11,000 years wondering what might have happened if this council had chosen differently, the first time my people stood where these humans now stand. I do not wish to spend the next 11,000 years wondering the same thing about them. No formal decree was issued that day. Instead, after hours of debate that resolved nothing entirely and settled nothing completely, the Vorlek speaker announced that the council would adjourn to consider the matter further, an outcome I later learned was almost unprecedented in the council's long history of swift, unquestioned judgments. We were escorted back to our shuttle in a silence that felt entirely different from the silence of my very first visit to that chamber, less like the quiet of judgment being passed, and more like the quiet of a question being genuinely asked for the first time. As we prepared to leave, Elder Vesh found me alone near the boarding ramp, his pale gold eyes searching my face with an expression I finally understood, standing there, at the end of everything we had survived together, to reach that moment. You asked me once, I said, before he could speak, whether our defenses would be enough. I remember, he said. I don't know if they will be. In the end, I admitted. I don't know what this council will decide, or whether we'll be standing here again in another year, having this same argument all over again. But I know we're not the same people who stood in that chamber the first time I came here, and I don't think we ever will be again. Elder Vesh was quiet for a long moment, and then, slowly, something shifted in his ancient, weathered features, something I could only describe as the faint, careful shadow of a smile. Then perhaps, he said, the ledger will need an entirely new category after all. The journey home felt different this time, not because the stars outside the viewport had changed, but because I had. I sat quietly for most of the trip, thinking back over everything that had happened since the day I first stepped nervously into that vast stone chamber, carrying nothing but a translator device, and no real understanding of what humanity was about to become. We had not won a war. The Council had not fallen, and the ancient order it represented remained, for now, largely intact, waiting somewhere out among the stars to decide what to do with a species it had never quite managed to categorize correctly. But we had proven something, in that chamber and in the skies above our own world, that no amount of careful diplomacy could have proven on its own. We had shown an ancient, weary galaxy that tribute was not, in fact, the only price of survival, that a species could refuse to kneel and still be left standing when the dust finally settled, and that sometimes, the smallest, plainest words carried more weight than any fleet, any empire, or any ledger ever could. 3 words had been enough to begin it. What came after would depend on all of us, together, choosing again and again to mean them. I looked out at the stars one last time before our shuttle broke back into Earth's atmosphere, and found myself thinking, not with fear this time, but with something close to hope, about everything still waiting for humanity out there in the vast, complicated dark. We had told the galaxy exactly who we intended to be. Now, all that remained was living up to it.